allow me to introduce myself. My name is Dr. John Hemmings. I'm an associate professor here at DKI APCSS, and we'd like to give a warm aloha, a warm welcome to this webinar on sources of disinformation. We're extremely excited tonight. We have a really superb group of experts in their field that we've been able to assemble. Such has been the demand for this event that we have just over 124 people in the room, and that's about 200 shy of what actually registered. So we had a total of 300 plus apply and register for this event. So you can tell just in that how of interest this is to the region, how important it is to the region, and certainly I think it's also a reflection of our wonderful speakers tonight that we've assembled for you. I would like to say a big thank you and welcome to people who are new to DKI APCSS. I see there's people from all over the Indo-Pacific region. We have some from Europe, some from South Asia, some from Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Isles. We also have a number of very senior alumni who have been in our doors before, including 4 ambassadors, a number of elected officials, a large number of staff officers who've made themselves known to us. Welcome back to your alum. We're very glad to have our ohana back, and we're glad that you took the time out of what is a busy schedule for you to join this event. I'm going to quickly move through some of the admin rules, and we're going to get started straight away. Essentially, the portion, we're going to have each speaker speak for 10 minutes, and then we're going to try to do a discussion. We may go over the hour, but I'm going to try to avoid that. I'm going to introduce each speaker before they speak. We're going to begin with Dr. Shashi Jayakumar, who's the head of the Center of Excellence for National Security, CENS, at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in NTU in Singapore. We will then move quickly to Edward Lucas and Anne-Marie Brady before opening up for discussion. Just a point on the discussions, because we have, I think we will continue to have people coming in, and I see the numbers still growing. We will probably do question and answers if you write them into the Q&A box, and we will have someone filter those questions to us, and I can moderate and send them out to our various panelists. It really is a first of a number of different things that I want to tell you about. This is the first one that looks at the sources of disinformation. How have we come to this stage from 2016 on, when we had Brexit and the US election, and we had all these various rises in disinformation that seem to be occurring in the social media sphere, now to what seems to be happening around COVID-19, events in the United States, and just the environmental age, the information environment, I should say, is one that is just of extreme interest to all practitioners in security, because it has become so volatile and so leveraged between states. With that, I'll move quickly on just to say that there will be another event, 2 events that will follow this in short succession. You will find those more on our websites, and we, of course, will email you. So just to quickly introduce you to our first speaker, Shashi Kumar, as I said, is the Center of SENS at RSIS. He has served in a variety of expert roles, including in the Singapore government as a research analyst with the Ministry of Defense. He also is at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy as a senior visiting research fellow, and is the executive coordinator of future issues and technology at RSIS. He is going to speak on sources of disinformation and extremism in the Indo-Pacific region. Shashi, if I may, the floor is yours. Please open your mic and your video screen so we can all see you, and we look forward to your remarks. And at about 10 minutes, I will reappear, and at 12 minutes, we'll go to our next speaker. So thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I'd like to thank you and DKI APCSS for the invitation to speak. It's a great honor. I'm going to speak about extremist sources of disinformation, but not just terrorist groups. I also want to talk about the sources which promote disinformation and intolerance. Firstly, in the general theater, and then more specifically, and I'm going to spend most time on this in Southeast Asia. Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as many of us know, have gloated about the impact of COVID-19 in the US in particular, seeing it as mark of divine vengeance. on the United States in particular and on the West. And in the flagship magazines of Al-Qaeda, AQ, and ISIS, they've described it as a clear sign of the divine changes engineered by God. The general tone and tenor of these messages has been to try to undermine the West, and also to put this as one of the consequences of China's abuse of the Uyghurs. That's quite a pronounced theme. So what in general the key jihadist groups are trying to do is to show that this is God's judgment which presages their final victory. This is theological, it's even eschatological, and in a way it's quite sober. And I mention this because the jihadist groups have, in my view, stayed away from overly outlandish fake news or conspiracy theories. On the other side, the far right, if you like, although depending on what theater you live in, it may not be called the far right, it may be called something else. That's a very febrile and fevered atmosphere. Some of the groups, extremist organizations, are leveraging on the pandemic to flood social media with fake news. Various right-wing extremist groups are spreading grand conspiracy theories to set populations against each other, to set themselves against governments. What are the targets? The targets are immigrants, Muslims, institutions related to the medical fraternity. And again, these can also feed into anti-Semitic narratives about the Jewish elites, how the Mossad or George Soros or Bill Gates are sort of tied into the creation of some mysterious bioweapon. I think we are familiar with most of this background. I just wanted to set us on the same page. Given this, I want to turn quickly to Asia, and particularly the Southeast Asian context. Some of what I'm about to cover is about extremist sources, but some of which is more general and covers the mood music of intolerance in the region, which, if you ask me, is actually the major concern. I can't cover all of Southeast Asia, but I want to turn to the areas which gives me the most pause. And perhaps the country which gives me the most concern is Indonesia. This can be a place where conspiracy, ideology, and paranoia mesh in a way which fuel intolerance. Some of the ISIS supporters in Indonesia have embraced this idea that the virus is a soldier of God, serving as a punishment for what's happened in Iraq and Syria, or punishment for what China has done to the Uyghurs. What's interesting and perhaps not altogether unexpected in the midst of this pandemic, which is also an infodemic, is the resurfacing of deep-seated and latent issues in Indonesian society, contempt and anger leveled towards not just China, but the Chinese Indonesian minority. And I would stress that this comes not just from the violent extremism networks in Indonesia, but the more general population. Something latent is surfacing or resurfacing. And these conspiracies or fake news can be quite local, quite personal on the one hand. For example, rumors of hospitalized patients with Chinese links, be careful of this hospital or that town, or more generally encouraging Indonesians to stay away from places where Chinese citizens or Indonesian Chinese work and live. One example is viral WhatsApp messages which say, throw away your Xiaomi mobile phones. Your coronavirus comes from China, it's spreading through the server, through the speakers, throw them away. So this kind of thing is actually quite common. Amidst all of this, there have been, by the jihadist groups, planned attacks by, for example, the Jamal Ansarut Daulah, which is a serious outfit responsible for the 2018 Surabaya church suicide bombings, and planned attacks by them against stores owned by Chinese Indonesians. And these plots are serious plots, they've been foiled. So that's one. But beneath the violent jihadist groups, you've got fairly hardline, but not necessarily jihadist groups like the FPE, the Front Pembela Islam, which have been pretty dismissive of the government response. And they've been providing their own advice, defying government advice, competing against state measures, and in some instances, actually providing their own social services to communities and community mosques. So these groups, hardline groups, are quite active on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram, and so on and so forth. That's Indonesia, and I hope we have a chance to come back to this later, because I don't really have a chance to do justice to the country. In the Philippines, I have yet to see any serious messaging or signature from groups like the Maute Group, DSG, Abu Sayyaf, or other Daulah Islamiyah factions I've yet to see anything very significant about COVID that I would think is really noteworthy. But I would point out that there is a certain amplification of conspiracy that comes from various quarters in the Philippines, which is a source for concern. Now, of course, amplification of manufacture does take place in Indonesia, but that's much more inward focus. The nodes in the Philippines, has been shown by very good reporting recently, is outward looking, and it's tied into this worldwide pandemic conspiracy, amplified by troll farms, which have been shown by research to be operating in the Philippines, in North Macedonia as well. The overall motif within this is that it's pandemic, it's manufactured by governments to control the people. We can talk about this later during the Q&A. I would point out here that the Philippines is a very well-established culture of troll farms, call centers. At the top, it's quite an organized, fairly hierarchical structure of brand consultancies, which will do the bidding of the highest bidder. And below, you've got the foot soldiers, the levels beneath, which have amplified the message of whoever pays top dollar. That's the Philippines. I think I would be remiss if I did not spend some time in Singapore. In Singapore, in my view, the issue is not so much extremist disinformation, but quite often misinformation, false reporting, taking things out of context. By official statistics, just to give you a flavor, of the 50 or so pieces of fake news which have had to be officially debunked in Singapore to date, none of these are actually extremist sources of information. These concern more local concerns and quite often circulated in the one WhatsApp group that you cannot exit, which is the family WhatsApp group. So day-to-day cost of living, where you can get vegetables in the market, rumors concerning an imminent lockdown where people from one part of the country, Singapore, cannot travel to the other. That's local. I would also observe that anti-China sentiment is quite a different equation in Singapore. Chinese are about 76% of the population. Singaporean Chinese feel themselves to be quite different from mainland Chinese. Maybe there has been some low-level xenophobia blaming foreigners, but just take a look at the dorm infections for foreign South Asian construction workers, where the numbers are through the roof. There has not been a xenophobic backlash against them, because deep down we realize we need them, they build Singapore. And in fact, this has given rise to a great deal of soul searching about how we should improve the conditions, how we should treat them better. The government in Singapore, for its part, has had to really up its game when it comes to rebuttal, setting up official WhatsApp groups, and the ability to debunk reasonably quickly. I think they've had to up their game, partly because we are about to have an election, likely within the next few months. And as Facebook has shown within the last few weeks, taken down accounts without details, but clearly coordinated inauthentic behavior linked accounts. I have no details on this. Facebook has not released them. That there is the possibility for the kinds of things which have happened elsewhere to come home to roost in Singapore. Excuse me. So let's do some stock taking, because I'm quickly running out of time. We all know, if we look at the Western theater, that you've got extremists, transatlantic extremists on the right, comparing notes, sowing seeds of discord within society, anti-vaxxers, hate groups, supremacists. Hey, COVID is a lab out of Wuhan, or even a US bioweapon is linked to 5G masks. I would make one observation, and if you take just one point away, make it this one, that these sort of grand conspiracy theories are not really things which have a great deal of traction in the ASEAN region. Why? I think academics and researchers will be debating for a long time. I would point out, you do not have English as a big unifying force. You don't have a North American movement equivalent to the far right that will communicate with like-minded people across the Atlantic. I'm not saying that people don't care, but I'm trying to advance some reasons why calls for insurrection have not really played out in Asia or Southeast Asia. I'm excluding Australia because Australian intelligence has shown within the last few weeks in its reports, there are extreme right-wing narratives there which paint the state as oppressive, globalization and democracy as flawed, and so on and so forth. Maybe Anne-Marie will have something to say about this later. Leaderships, however hardline they may be, very authoritarian in some cases, leaderships generally have very little truck for polarization linked themes and narratives. One exception, and I unfortunately cannot spend a great deal of time on this, is outside of Southeast Asia, is India, where you have this notion of a great replacement carried out by the Muslims, not altogether unlike what you see in the Western theater. Themes of Corona Jihad, which I think must be familiar to many of you, fake and dubious videos showing Muslims licking fruit for sale or violating lockdown rules. So this is something which unfortunately is becoming very, very prevalent in South Asia. And I think security services, think tankers, and practitioners, because of the Indian diaspora, will have to look out for this kind of thing seeping into Southeast Asia. So I'm going to end there because I think I'm almost about to run out of time. But just to take home the point that the radicalized will always have a way or means to spread conspiracies. But if this continues longer, if the lockdown continues in various countries, if the paranoia gets fueled further, the conspiracists themselves may to some degree become infected, may become radicalized. So I'm going to leave you on that point and hope to take questions down the line. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jayakumar. That's a wonderful, excellent opening for us, and I think got all of our juices flowing and thinking about this information across the region and more widely. Our second panelist is Edward Lucas. He's a senior fellow at the Center of European Policy Analysis. He's also been a senior editor at The Economist. I first saw him at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, when one of his 4 books came out, The New Cold War, about Putin's Russia. He's an expert in espionage, subversion, and uses and abuses of history. And I turn the floor over to you now, sir.
Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're listening. First of all, thank you to Dr. Hemmings and the Center for hosting this. It's great to have interaction between the people with the Indo-Pacific lens and the people who tend to look at it from a European or transatlantic one. I'm going to talk about Russia and start off with the origins, and then impacts, and then responses of Russian disinformation. And the first thing to say is this is not new. This is something that the Soviet Union was very good at. There was a thing called agitprop, which stood for agitatia and propaganda, which was developed by Lenin. The idea was that propaganda was the more sort of rational stuff and agitation was slogans and half-truths. This was for political education at home and for political warfare abroad. And it's really well worth remembering that the Soviet Union did this in conditions of considerable difficulty. They had printing press, shortwave radio, telex machines, things like that. But it was very hard to operate under the cloak of anonymity and deniability. They did do it, and they notably managed to launch the idea that the CIA was responsible for developing the HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, and they planted this in an Indian, obscure Indian newspaper and fanned the flames until it became perhaps one of the most successful information operations of the Cold War. Modern Russia has many more advantages. They are able to do it with the internet, which offers anonymity, ubiquity, and immediacy in a way that the Soviet Union didn't have. And so there's a great deal more impact, a great deal more effect, a great deal more flexibility. So we see Russian information operations going from the absolutely official statements, the Russian embassy Twitter account coming out with messaging, through to state-funded outlets and institutions, proliferators and proxies of Russian influence, social media operations, which may be pretty not avowed at all, through to the cyber operations of hacking and leaking, disrupting opponents and so on. So there's a full spectrum. But there's a full spectrum in another way, that it's a great mistake to see information operations in isolation. Information operations are part of influence operations. We tend to seize on them and look at them because they tend to be conspicuous. The information is there. And so we can spend a lot of time analyzing the propagation, the narratives, trying to make sense of it. But we should always remember that the bit we can see may be the tip of the iceberg. The most important thing that's going on may be other aspects of the influence operation. It may be subversion, it may be the use of dirty money, maybe intimidation, military bluff and saber rattling, diplomatic divide and rule games. There's a whole range of different tactics. And if anyone's interested, I can send them, who's watching this, just message me and I can send a copy of a piece I wrote called The Toxic 20, which lists those tactics and influence operations and looks at which of them are specific to Russia, which are specific to China, and which are being used by both. The theatre in which these tactics have been deployed has shifted. Largely because Russia's become stronger and more ambitious. So the initial theatre of operations was the Baltic states and the so-called near abroad, the countries that had been part of the Soviet Empire, and where Russia, even in the 90s, felt that it still retained some kind of rights to influence domestic politics, sometimes on issues such as language and citizenship laws, or to stop these countries, as Russia saw it, drifting off to the West. And those narratives have been largely unsuccessful in the so-called Eastern Europe. Russia's attempted to play divide and rule, to make out that these states are failed and friendless. Sometimes they accuse them of fascism and so on. And this broadly has been an unsuccessful attempt. These countries have intensified their pro-Western orientation. They've joined the European Union and NATO. They've become successful in political and economic terms. And it's hard to look at Russian operations in any of the former Soviet Empire and say, gosh, that really worked. The success has been greater, paradoxically, going further west. And that's because Western countries were profoundly complacent and naive about what they were dealing with Russia. They were absolutely determined to see Russia as a, if not a friend, at least a partner, as a very promising emerging market. A country that had put the Soviet past behind it, that had what seemed to be a more or less functioning democracy. And so this threat perception, or this failure to have a threat perception, created very fertile ground in countries such as Germany, Italy, France, Britain, even the United States, for these Russian information operations. And we have they were backed up, as I say, by other influence operations. In the case of Germany, for example, exporting natural gas through a special pipeline that was built across the Baltic Sea, but many other aspects as well. And that has been more successful. And we have seen only really since the invasion of and occupation of Crimea and other parts of eastern Ukraine in 2014 have we really seen Western countries waking up to the threat. The best way of characterizing it is divide and rule, or divide and distract. Russia does not expect that it can actually recreate its full sort of superpower status that it lost in 1991. They don't think they're going to be able to recreate East Germany, have the Warsaw Pact, this huge sort of geopolitical entity that they had in Soviet days. But what they do want to do is to divide the Western-based rules, Western-led rules-based multilateral order, because this is very intimidating when it's seen from Russia. If you see all the countries of Europe and North America following the same rules, making decisions together, perhaps even joined by countries in the Indo-Pacific region, from a country of Russia's size, that looks really intimidating. And you feel that this is a world order that Russia is not part of, that played no part in shaping, and is now going to be bossed around. And they particularly hate the way in which smaller countries seem to have a voice in this, and they really get very upset by the idea that a country like Poland can be setting rules which then apply to Russia. And so the aim is to try and make sure that world order doesn't work, and that means dividing it. So they want to sow divisions across the Atlantic, sow divisions within the European Union and NATO, and sow divisions within countries. And they do this, and we saw this very clearly, by stoking political polarization. This is the greatest asset that they have, that our countries are naturally, because of other historical processes, losing cohesion, losing social trust, and so it's easy to polarize. And we saw dramatic examples of that in the United States, where simply using Facebook, they were able to organize demonstrations of right-wing and left-wing extremists in the same place in towns and cities in in North America. You set up Facebook pages, whether it's for Texas independence or black nationalism or any cause, you attract supporters to it, whip them up, feed them with a mixture of slogans and half-truths and real arguments and facts of a kind that Vladimir Lenin would absolutely recognize. And then whoosh, you're off the races. And next thing you know, these people are doing things, they're politically active, they've and the key factor is losing confidence in the system and in the public institutions that make a Western country strong. So that divide and rule has been particularly successful, I would argue, in the United States, although I wouldn't say that it's to any particular benefit of any one country, but I think it's an accepted fact in American institutions that there have been these operations. They've been quite successful in Britain, and they've been quite successful in other Western countries, rather less so, as I say, in Eastern Europe. Now, what's the response to this been? Well, it's been belated and partial. We focused very much on the idea that you can deal with this by fact-checking. And so we have fact-checking institutions that come out with rebuttals of conspiracy theories, rebuttals of the different sorts of Kremlin myth-making, and that works to some extent. It works at an elite level. If people Google something and they say, "Oh, that turns out that's not true," well, it can work, but it's a very partial answer. And I would I caution people who think that the way to deal with disinformation is fact-checking. We've seen attempts to identify sources better. We have things like NewsGuard, which for a small subscription will give you a little accuracy rating or integrity rating for any source of news that you come across. And they say, does this source print regular rebuttals and corrections and clarifications? That's a sign of kind of health in a news organization. Does it have an identifiable street address as someone in charge? A lot of the outlets that Russia uses to promote its disinformation are fundamentally phony. When you Google them, there's nothing there. There's no street address. There's no real person. They never print letters to the editor or deal with any sort of mistakes that they made. So that helps. And the platforms, Facebook, Twitter, particularly Twitter more than Facebook, but the platforms are increasingly trying to deal with the sort of anonymity. But again, that's only a partial answer. And I would be, again, cautious. I used to be a great believer that if you could deal with anonymity on the internet, you would deal with most of the problem. But I think that the fundamental problem is that our information systems are weak because of other reasons in our society. Loss of professional ethics, perhaps, among journalism, commercial changes that make high quality journalism less commercially secure, changes in the advertising market and so on, and wider changes in society. And this brings me to my final point, which I will close on, that on the whole, I think that certainly Russian influence operations, and probably other ones as well, work principally not because they're great, but because they're weak. The divisions are largely maybe exploited by Russia. The conspiracy theories are believed by real people in the West, not sort of droids who've been parachuted into our midst by Russia. But none of this happens because we were invaded. We didn't have tanks in the streets of the city of London pointing their turrets at the Bank of England and saying, change the financial system, open your financial system to dirty Russian money. We insist that you list these Russian state-owned proxy companies on your stock exchanges. We didn't have tanks in Whitehall and Westminster saying to our political system, open your coffers to money from Russian, or for that matter, Chinese donors. No, we did this to ourselves. We opened our system up because we were perhaps greedy, perhaps corrupt, perhaps lazy, perhaps just naive and complacent. And because we have allowed this space for these influence operations and for this disinformation, we've allowed social trust to erode, we've allowed our institutions to weaken, we failed to police things properly, and everything from counterintelligence at the sort of sharp end through to how our academic and university institutions work at the other. We've created space for these hostile state actors to conduct their operations. And surprise, surprise, they've seen the weaknesses. Sometimes they see the weaknesses much more clearly than we do, and they're exploiting them. We are now playing catch up from a long way behind. We've more or less woken up to the threat, but the threat is evolving. and we are still dealing, I think, with the operations that we saw 5 years ago, rather than thinking what might be coming down the track in 5 years' time. But the good news is, I think that because we fundamentally allowed these weaknesses to develop, we can fix them. This is fundamentally not a problem of means. This is a problem of willpower and coordination, and the solution to a lack of willpower and coordination is you increase your willpower and coordination, and that, I hope, will be the story of the coming years. Thank you again very much for inviting me. I look forward with great pleasure to Anne-Marie Brady, who is a real fantastic expert on China and has pioneered the study of this, and I also look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Edward. Wonderful, wonderful talk. Please, as you're listening to our next panelist, please prepare some questions for our three panelists. You can write them into the Q&A box, which if you're on your PCs. It just leads me to introduce Professor Anne-Marie Brady, Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Canterbury University in New Zealand, and someone who I think sent kind of lightning bolt throughout the region and throughout where I was, even in London, in 2017 when her Magic Weapons paper came out and immediately struck everyone on what was happening on the other side of the world, how important it was to us. And so with that, I will say very little because I think better to hear from her than for me to tell you more about her bio. Anne-Marie, the floor is yours.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Warm Pacific greetings, everyone, from cold and rainy Otautahi Christchurch. So I'm really delighted to have been able to go after Shashi and Edward, because I think that it's like unfolding a flower here. There is many different aspects where I think where our conversations are going to connect. So I'm quite excited already by what I've heard. So I have been given the brief to talk about the CCP's or Chinese Communist Party's disinformation activities and overall their propaganda activities. Propaganda is not a negative word for the CCP. Xuanchuan, it's a normal task of government. In fact, the party calls it the lifeblood of their whole setup, their way of running the country. It's absolutely essential. So what's very interesting to me, observing about what's going on and the prevalence of very hostile and often false narratives, is this is not the norm for the CCP. I have been studying the Chinese Communist Party's domestic and foreign propaganda activities and the whole set of organisations involved since from about mid-90s anyway. I sort of started a part of my PhD, looked at it, and then it became a book, and then I continued looking at it. And in my work, I sort of go right back to looking at how the CCP, what they were doing from the beginning, the 1920s, what were the patterns all the way up to 1940s and so on. So we did see, as Edward mentions, that the Russians the CCP did use agitprop in the, particularly noticeable in the 1940s, and they're trying to win the Civil War, and there were all sorts of negative narratives. The classic one was about American soldiers raping Chinese girls and other kind of incidents, situations like that. Some of them were real, but some of them weren't. And in the Cultural Revolution, there was also a lot of disinformation and directed towards the Chinese public about what was going on in the outside world, as well as directing internationally. And there's a classic saying of that era: all under heaven is chaos, and chaos is good. But what's so really interesting to me and very troubling is that post-78, the guideline very much was positive propaganda. The Chinese word is 正面宣传, positive propaganda. And so what that means is that where there's negative news, it just gets elided. And this is what happened in the SARS outbreak, if you remember, in 2003, 2004, is it occurred, like COVID, at the time of a crucial sort of transition point where the party only wanted happy news in the lead up to the Chinese New Year. And this is exactly what's happened part of what's happened with COVID. And so the news about that epidemic was suppressed. And then there was because epidemics are part of health propaganda within the CCP system, which is it's not all about political propaganda. And the lesson from SARS was that negative news should be released. And the example that was used in the discussions, the classified materials that I looked at, was the mad cow disease in Britain, and how it was very painful for the farmers to have to kill their herds, and yet it was part of the healing of the community is acknowledging that grief and showing those images of the terrible destruction. And so very much the trend has been all these years to, if there's something bad news, just don't talk about it and only talk about the good stuff. And there was a change though. In June 2009, you had protests in Urumqi, which the peaceful protests of Uyghur peoples, which were met with violence, and they were responded to with some violence. And then there was a decision made to so-called show the true face of East Turkestan. So that was oral instruction from the Central Propaganda Department to release violent images or images of violence, and predictably it led to more violence. This is a real departure. They don't normally do anything like that, because part of the job of the propaganda system is to manage important jobs that manage public opinion, and certainly not to stir up ethnic unrest. And then also in 2009 is when the big foreign propaganda budget began. Massive amounts of money available to Xinhua and CCTV International, what became CGTN, to go global. But then by the time Xi Jinping came into power, the propaganda specialists who I was talking to were saying it was a failure. They spent all this money, but no one's watching. No one's sort of deliberately wanting to watch CCTV International. It's boring, and the same China Daily. And so there was a refocus, more money was thrown at it. And at the same time, you've got the reform of the PLA and military intelligence within the PLA. So I've put some little links to papers I've written there. I've got one coming out in July about how China spies. And some of you, this will be totally old hat, but for those who it isn't, it's interesting to me that one of the new tasks of one of the new agencies of military intelligence is the Strategic Support Force, and it's in charge of cyber, psych, and political warfare, psychological and political warfare. So I suspect that's one reason why we're seeing this, because it's part of what Mao Zedong would call the tongue war, and it's both defensive and offensive. This negative information, and the goal is shock and awe. So a bit different from what Edward was telling us with the Russian approach. And so other changes, the 90th Party Congress in 2017, where Xi Jinping is announcing his global vision, and you've got the re-merging of the party organisations like the International Liaison Department with the agencies that were above the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the United Front Work Department was also incorporated what were state organisations. So after 1949, the party and state was supposedly separate. The Soviets insisted on that. Under Xi, they've been re-merged. And I think this is another reason why we're seeing, this change in undiplomatic diplomacy is what I've called it. And of course, the big, if going on my chronology, another big change, of course, is COVID. And, Xi has been ruling China in crisis mode from the time he came to power, but he's really ruling it in crisis mode now. And so we saw the exact date, we don't know now what's the exact date that the first cases of COVID appeared, but I'm what they call a daughter of Wuhan the Shifu, and so I happen to know a daughter-in-law of Wuhan. So I know that from mid-December, schools were in semi-quarantine and all the military institutes were closed down. The suppression of the news was going from December. The disinformation seems to start a little bit, deliberate fake stories like, the US calls it and so on, starts later. So this is a, as I was saying, this is a departure from normal practices, but it is following a trajectory. And what else do I want to tell you about? Oh yes, the other thing I want to say before I see John there, which means I must be running out of time, yeah, is that, again, as I was saying, we've seen the CCP has been trying to shift global narratives for a while. So people have really noticed when the diplomats got on Twitter. They're also on Facebook. It's very much depends on, in my country, Facebook's more popular than Twitter for most people. So our Chinese embassy is on Facebook, not Twitter. They're also in YouTube, but they're in WeChat big time and all the Chinese language media abroad, except for Falun Gong stuff. The party has been trying to shape narratives and control the narratives on China for at nearly 10 years. It's been a big effort. It's gone into academia, it's gone into Hollywood. It's had a big impact on the news media internationally, not just with the paid inserts, but also even in acquisitions of or investments in some companies. So, and I really point you to, what we're seeing is like tip of the iceberg, what you can see in English language materials versus what's there in the Chinese language environment. This is a big problem for those of us who've got countries with large diasporas, Chinese diasporas, because they experience a different set of current information about current affairs than the rest of us do. And there's very little alternative to it. And one of the pieces of advice that I've had to governments who have a bit of resources is how about setting up the Chinese politics equivalent of Al Jazeera, a voice that will give some credible news on China, information due with China. So I'm going to end it there to leave the floor open to the next speakers, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, and thank you to all of our panelists for finishing on time. Just because we came in late, we may go over 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Please let me know, panelists, if you can do that. So I'll ask the panelists now to turn on their video screen so that we can see you. Our numbers have actually been going up since we have been in the room. Clearly, some people were unable to get in and have since come in. And I see a ton of questions have rolled in as well. Please keep them coming. So I'm going to start firing them out at our various panelists. And if you would like, people who are about to ask questions, if you would like to direct them at a particular panelist, some of them are pretty general, then let us know. Otherwise, I will direct them myself to the person it seems the most appropriate for. So having said that, we had some sent to us in advance of the event, which I'm going to read out. The first one, it says, when the PRC and Russian Federation have people prosecuting their intent without regulation, how can nations on the receiving end of disinformation campaigns effectively respond? We are, of course, doing an event on that very subject, which is on policy prescriptions. But I think I could throw that question to Edward, because you started down that route in the end of your remarks, and I think you thought quite a little bit about that. I think if I may, with Shashi, how can we recognize disinformation? What are some of the key ways that you think that would be useful for people who are security practitioners or journalists or public officials in our audience? How can we recognize it? What are the key ways? And finally, one for Anne-Marie. Do you see that their goals and tactics are aligned with other actors? I think in your case, it would be interesting, and Edward, if you want to take a slight stab at this, are Russian and Chinese disinformation efforts aligned? Obviously, there's to some extent in terms of who they are targeting, there may be, but so with that, can we start in the opposite order? We'll start with Anne-Marie Brady, then go to Edward, and then go to Shashi. So Anne-Marie, do you see alignment between the various disinformation actors, Russia and China, for example?
The CCP and Russia have signed a couple of agreements for cooperation on media/propaganda, so that's already been agreed. But I'd have to ask the cyber specialists in the room if they'd tell us if they picked up on, traffic of, the research, you look into the bots, I suppose, and things like that, the connections, if they're making connections to each other, passing on disinfo. So there is definitely that agreement there, but I think I was really very interested this week to see the arrest of a very senior Russian Arctic scientist who's been visiting one of the most important universities for China's polar policies, and had some papers in his bag that the FSB didn't think he should have. Because I've been wondering what are the limits on Sino-Russian cooperation, and I see that there are some. And with the horrible situation at the moment is we've got a strategic triangle going on, and the West is at the pointy end of it, and that's very unpleasant. So however unappealing it may seem, you have to do something about that. And I just want to say, adding on to I actually want to jump in on the question that you've given to Edward about what to do about it, and I want to jump in on his last comment of what to do. This is a concept that I like to go global. I call it UF, the United Front against the United Front. So we're getting this mass of China's using, they call it total diplomacy. That's one way to call it. Using every possible element to as part of its agenda, and trying to forming temporary alliances against the main enemies, classic Leninism. Well, we can take that kind of thinking, and we need to form united fronts amongst all the like-minded states, and they're not all necessarily classic democracies. Vietnam is your friend at the moment, for example. And we have to help each other economically. That's absolutely crucial, because the way that China has got a country like mine wobbling at the knees is the fear of loss of access to the China market. And so we have to support each other. And that's the message economically. And that's the message that I want everyone in the room to send back to their governments, please. So that's my answer to the solution, is the United Front against the United Front. And it's not ideological, it's a tactical alliance, and that the way to support each other is economically.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Edward, alignment and policy prescriptions?
I think there's tactical alignment, and we've seen the Russians supporting China during COVID, saying these attacks on the PRC are unfair. So I think there's no great love lost between them, but at the moment they see that the West is weak, and they're happy. They're trying to kick the same doors down, so they kick them down. What they do when they're through the door is another matter. But I think the thing I particularly want to say is on response. Just because you're being hit by an information operation doesn't mean your response should be on the information side. They use a wide range of tactics. We should use a wide range of tactics. And so it might be that the right response is a diplomatic protest. It might be the right response is a counterintelligence response. You throw out some Russian or Chinese intelligence officers. It might be that the right response is a prosecution. But we shouldn't allow our responses to be dictated by the tactic that they've used. So Anne-Marie's office is burgled in New Zealand. I think the New Zealand police should be taking that rather seriously, as she's the leading expert on Chinese security in New Zealand, and it's highly likely the Chinese are up to it, are behind it. And we've tended to be very worried about overreacting. This has been the great sort of hallmark of Western response, both to Russia and to China. Let's not overreact. And that's both, can be a good thing. Don't give them the satisfaction of knowing that they've provoked us. Maybe they're trying to provoke us. It's more often an excuse for cowardice. And there are 2 points I want to make very importantly. One is that we have collective action is really important. Because they try and play divide and rule and pick off one country and say, you won't be able to export to us, we'll go after your citizens, we'll stir up trouble for you, as whether it's Sweden or Lithuania or Estonia or Australia or New Zealand. And so we need to know that if you do this to one country, do it to a lot of them. The EU should be good at this. It's getting better. It's not yet. It would have been great if we'd had the Trans-Pacific Partnership and TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnerships, which I think would have set a kind of global economic governance framework in which a lot of these tactics would have been less effective. I think there's also room for symbolic action, and particularly the PRC has become obsessed with the question of Taiwan, something that they were not obsessed with before 2012, but Xi Jinping's made it into a big deal of trying to police every Western country's involvement with Taiwan. And if the Dutch mission in Taipei changes its logo and changes its title, you get a furious, splenetic reaction from Beijing. Well, I say bring it on. Yeah, if they are allowing themselves to be wound up by these things, we should make the most of this and make symbolic responses that consume a huge amount of their energy and attention. And the more they're frothing about that, the less they'll be able to froth about other things. So we should analyze their weaknesses the way that they've analyzed ours. And when we see that they've got psychological hang-ups or political priorities that cause them disproportionate expenditure of energy, we should say, great, this is a weakness, let's make the most of that and tie them up a bit and raise their blood pressure.
Thank you very much. I do remember when I saw you speak in London, you mentioned, access to London markets, listing of companies. So there is a range of things that
absolutely, yes. I mean, that would be another very clear thing we can do. We can say, if you don't play by our rules, you can't list your companies on our stock exchanges. We have that's at our discretion. Nobody's stopping us doing that. It's just we need to show a bit of boldness and decision and decisiveness.
Excellent. Shashi, apologies. Shashi, you've been very patient. So I thought perhaps for you might look at how do we recognize disinformation, and if you have insights on policy solutions or what to do about it.
2 years ago, 2018, there was a high-level, high-profile select committee which looked at this issue of disinformation attacks in Singapore. It's a public report, 300 pages long, so you might want to take your time going through it. You can find it online. But within it, just on one page, there's a description of a one-day closed-door hearing. No one else was in the room about how the committee was briefed by Singapore security agencies concerning how Singapore had been a victim of disinformation attacks by not just one, but more than one state actors. So that's quite important, because within the Singapore context, when we try to attribute, that's about the furthest that we go. Whether that's the right way or the wrong way, we can have a long discussion. In the West, when you're being attacked by, let's say, China or Russia, in cyber disinformation, you tend to call out, depending on the country in question. In Asia and Southeast Asia, the stakes and the calculus is actually quite different. So the country in that report, which I just mentioned, was not named. And generally speaking, when we're attacked by cyber means, kinetic cyber, or by disinformational means, government statements tend to be not exactly anodyne, but there's no direct calling out. So it therefore falls to others. Those of you who are familiar with the Singapore context will know that retired diplomats, well, one in particular, if you know who I mean, do actually call out the sort of hybrid modes and means employed by China against Singapore. And it runs the entire gamut, as has been pointed out. It's not just disinformation, it's combined with economic pressure, diplomatic vaccines, maneuverings. And the narrative may well be something like this. Hey, you Singapore, you're too close to the US. Can't you understand that China is going to be the eventual winner in terms of the South China Sea game? By the way, your leadership, meaning Singapore leadership, is a disappointment. Don't you realize that Lee Kuan Yew, who's passed on, was the last leader who really understood us, and so on and so forth. One can go on. Behind the scenes, these kinds of narratives are pushed. There's some evidence to suggest that it transposes, and I think this is a great work which has not been written, transposes from the Chinese social media sphere and makes its way to the English Singapore social media scene as well. That's quite important, faculties. In the old days, when we read text, we read the lines, we read between the lines, we read the appendices, the footnotes and everything. Now in this somewhat attention-starved, or rather where attention spans are rather short, I think it makes us vulnerable to these kinds of disinformational attacks. I would end my comment by making a point. Singapore has tried to maintain this dynamic equilibrium between China and the United States for a long time. The fact that we try to do this is starting to anger one of those two countries that I've just mentioned, because they can't see why we would continue to cling to that. But that's the Singapore point of view. If you look at Southeast Asia, some of them, these nations have already thrown in their lot and decided who the eventual winners may well be. So they don't really see it through that lens. And the fact that China may well be the eventual winners is not really something which they are too bothered about. And this influences the diplomatic and the political calculus. It influences the way they look at what we might call fake news.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, all three panelists. I hope you can stick with us for 10 more minutes as we just take one last round of questions. I've been going through, we've got about 20 questions, and my apologies to you at home if we don't get to answer them. Some of them are similar questions, and so I'm going to combine them. Other are quite unique and quite interesting. So we have questions about the balance, finding the balance between free flow of information and disinformation. So how do you handle information if you're in a state and you're dealing with legislation and you have to find that balance? And of course, there are people who are likely to abuse that balance. Also, even though we are going to do our second series of projects and podcasts, we'll be dealing particularly with how the humanitarian and the health situation has been impacted by disinformation, particularly health workers and pharmaceutical goods. There is a great question. There's two questions, actually. One from Africa. How do we combat WhatsApp groups that are saying this medicine or that medicine can solve COVID-19, and those things are thus bought off the shelf? But also, how do we deal with misinformation? That seems more misinformation than disinformation, and I think there is a bit of a line there that we can discuss. And then there's a third question, which I think, and I'm just going to open it, if you will just in your closing remarks, maybe answer one or two of these points, but keep it to about 3 minutes each so that we can close on time. And the third one I think is quite interesting is how have Chinese narratives affected, and I suppose this could apply to Russia. What's the interplay between their disinformation campaigns and their foreign policies? We had two questions, one from Vietnam, one from the Philippines. They were very similar, so I'm kind of combining them. How has Xi leveraged the disinformation campaigns to try to influence states in Southeast Asia over the South China Sea? And so with that, maybe we can start with Edward, go to Shashi, and end with Anne-Marie Brady. So Edward, I gave you a medley, a buffet of questions. Do you want me to remind you them? There's the kind of, I suppose you could look at how does Russia use its disinformation as a tool of its wider geopolitical foreign policy? To some extent, your remarks did address that, but if you wanted to explore them more deeply, there was also the medical side. I'm not sure if Russia has been specifically tied to COVID-19 disinformation. And the one on the South China Sea clearly isn't for you. Do you have any sense of a question there that you would like? How about the balance between freedom of information and disinformation? How do democratic societies deal? Do we legislate? Or...
You read my mind, John, because that's the one I wanted to answer. So I think there's a real danger that we deal with Putinism. We try to fight Putinism, but we end up by Putinizing our own societies. And I'm not sure whether that's actually a Russian goal, but it certainly would suit Russia very well if we destroy our institutions and give up our freedoms in order to defend ourselves against a country which has destroyed its institutions and given up its freedoms and seeks to attack us. And what I mean by this is, for example, example is saying, we don't like this broadcaster, it's pumping out disinformation into our system, let's ban it. Now, sometimes that's the right answer. The broadcast media space is regulated, there are rules, and we've just hauled up the state television for broadcasting a forced confession of a jailed British citizen in China, Peter Humphrey, and that breaks the Ofcom rather wet media regulator does have some rules, and they've broken it. And RT, the Russian broadcaster, has also had slaps on the wrist, and it goes from rebukes to fines to ultimately you can lose your terrestrial broadcasting license. And if we have rules, yes, we should definitely enforce them. But I think the knee-jerk response of banning media we don't like, demanding access to encrypted communications, is these things should be the last resort rather than the first resort. And similarly, I also think, although I'm a very strong believer in improving our counterintelligence services, and we need to move towards a more strategic use of counterintelligence, I don't think all foreign interference should be dealt with through the CI counterintelligence lens. Again, that it risks turning us into a country like Russia, where all criticism and all foreign activity is seen as a matter for the for counterintelligence. As I said earlier, we have a very wide range of responses that we can take. We can take them on our own as national governments and through our public institutions. We can also take them in solidarity with our allies. And that gives us a really wide palette from which we can paint. And if they are annoying us on one front, well, we can push back by doing something else. We could have, all the EU countries saying we don't like the way the Belt and Road Initiative is working in the EU, so we're changing our rules on foreign investment in infrastructure, or we're pushing back with the 3Cs initiative, which is our kind of Western-sponsored rival. Or we could say, you know what, we're all going to upgrade our offices in Taipei, and they're all going to now be called our national office, not anymore economic and social affairs office or something like that. We can do stuff. We can say we will invite the Dalai Lama to come speak at a meeting of the European Council. There's all sorts of things that we can do which will annoy Russia or annoy China, and our decision to push back. And we should cherish the right we have to make those decisions rather than being bumped into a sort of knee-jerk response, which may be bad for our society, not terribly effective, discredit us in the eyes of the outside world, and actually be the thing that our adversary wants.
Wonderful. You've been very succinct. Shashi, did you need me to go through the questions again, or did you find one from the buffet I laid out? It was kind of COVID, I suppose, infectious diseases, how COVID-19 has been.
If you'd be so kind as to highlight maybe the salient ones, I could try to tackle.
Yes, of course. There was one on the South China Sea, on how has China used a disinformation campaign to leverage the information environment in those countries. There's also been what's the balance in a healthy society between over-regulating media companies from those countries that may be the sources of disinformation.
Sure.
Is that helpful?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start from this premise. It's more the second half of your questions. I touched on this a little bit earlier during my remarks. Singapore is quite an unusual society. It's within the heart of Southeast Asia. It's pretty well educated, depending on which survey you look at. In some ways, it's quite westernized. I think the education is something that's going to have to be ramped up in a particular manner. If you look at counter disinformation efforts halfway across the world, let's say, for example, the Baltic states, look at what the Latvians, the Lithuanians, and to some degree the Nordics, the Scandinavians have done. Of course, they're a bit different. They're on the front line. They face these kinds of things almost every other day. But my point is, particularly the Estonians, because they faced a massive cyber hack before, so they've seen both sides. You take the population into an adult, reasoned, mature, and close conversation, and you say, this is the threat. But you're not trying to do it in a way which seeds paranoia at the same time. And that's going to be very, very important. I would say, especially within the Singapore context, because Singapore, if you know anything about it, it's got a strong government. The ruling party has never lost power. Nothing security-wise serious has ever happened in Singapore. We've had a close call in terms of terrorist attacks, but it's never actually happened. Cyber attacks, major ones have happened, including against government agencies, and disinformation, yes. But these are not the kind which are visible and visceral, which seem to hurt us, our everyday lives. So we have these normal conditions, you could almost say super normal, which sort of works against us counterintuitively in terms of resilience, because we assume whenever there is a big security problem, government is going to come in and fix it. That works. it works until it doesn't work. So my point is, this reason conversation that I'm positing or postulating needs to be not the boy who cried wolf set of possibilities, but which needs to be coordinated with the people where for the first time the people are brought into key national security discourse and realize they need to take ownership of the problem. Of course, there have to be government educative efforts. And there has to be, probably my last point here, a reasoned conversation with the social media companies. Of course, there's a lot going on right now as we speak about this. But if you look at the news in Singapore within the last few days, Facebook has announced in advance of the Singapore election, they started takedowns of coordinated accounts, meaning a presage to inauthentic behavior. That's big news. The Facebook outfit plus Google and so on, the outfits in Singapore are not just the Singapore outfits, they're the Asia-Pac outfits, and the Election Integrity Center for the region is run out of Singapore. I can foresee a situation where both for the cyber and the disinformation, government and regulators will want to work in much closer concert, maybe much more than the Facebooks of the world might be comfortable with, in order to stop this activity on its tracks. And I think for a country like Singapore, maybe Vietnam and others, they want to hold this kind of thing in much closer or tighter leash than even Western governments would have a comfort level with. So the rules of the game are a little bit different here. And finally, I will point out, having got my start in my government career in radicalization and extremism studies, there's so many parallels in terms of the echo chambers and the filter bubbles that people on both sides are working with. So we need multidisciplinary teams. I hope they exist within the social media companies, certainly within government and think tanks, tackling the problem. If you see anyone who calls themselves a newly minted disinformation expert, don't believe him or her. These are the people I trust the least.
Well, that's why we're so fortunate to have you all, who are all different experts of long pedigree in those various topics. And as you can see, our numbers are still high. Anne-Marie, you have you have the floor. Do you need me to offer up the question?
No, thanks. No, I know what I want to talk about. So there's a couple of strands that I want to pick up on. One is about the response. So the problem is in the Western world, particularly in Europe, but also in Australia and New Zealand and the US, that everyone thought the Cold War was over in 1989 and 1991. But if from Beijing looking out and Pyongyang looking out and Vietnam looking out, it wasn't. And the sources I read in Chinese, they continue to point that out. So we all got rather tired. We've got the fatigue, but and it's become. I know there's a debate going on in the US a lot about the word, who's Cold War, or is it China being Cold War, or the people in the US? Well, I've studied the institutions of the Cold War, what the CIA was funding China Quarterly, the main journal of my field, and Counter magazine, and a whole lot of other activities, and all the Five Eyes countries invested in what was called publicity and information bureaus. And I've written about them critically in the past, but I actually really understand the point of them now. When you're getting this wave of disinformation and hostile messaging, that's defensive tactic. So we need to persuade our governments collectively that they need to learn some of the lessons from the defensive mechanisms of the Cold War era. So I'm not going to take up time going into detail on that, but I put that out there. But we've also got some modern initiatives underway. My government led from the horrific March 15th terror attack that we had in my city, the Christchurch call. And France joined with New Zealand in that. And a lot of the Western social media companies have joined in that. We need to get the Chinese social media companies like Tencent and WeChat to be part of it. So that's something we can do. And then on to the questions about the South China, a couple of questions there about South China Sea. There's one about could the CCP be putting their own candidates up in elections? 100%, they already are. They're certainly doing that in my country. And it didn't just happen lately. I mean, so this is the huge, huge challenge, is how to support the ethnic Chinese communities in each society to be involved in politics and protect them from the shoulder taps that they will get once they get active. And also how to support our political parties in not getting tired people who are already CCP operatives getting their way into their political parties. This is one of the big challenges for our governments to manage that issue. And it's going to take a lot of tact and thinking about. And then there were a couple of questions about whether or not within Russia and China, citizens would recognize disinfo or be pushing back on it. And maybe in another more tolerant time, but not at this moment, not under Xi and not under Putin, that there would not that people could voice it. But certainly Chinese people are amazingly good at, they have sort of this antenna on their head for reading the political signals. So they're pretty sharp. And that's my final point I want to say, is that we need to develop that capacity ourselves in our own countries. And I learned last year that Finland have a brilliant program where they're upskilling their population and how to recognize disinfo, and it's mostly Russian, of course. And so that means they've got a country where they're talking about the problem. This is a big issue for my country, is that our Prime Minister will not name the problem. And if you have a country where that's happening, then it's really hard. A lot of people won't join with the message, but also people don't really know what's going on, and the media won't. Well, you know, if you've got a weakened media, they're not going to help you either. So we need collective action. We need our politicians to name the problem factually, not in an ideological way, and then help our citizens to upskill so they've got that inoculation. They're still going to get the disinformation coming at them, but they'll recognise it. That's something we can do. And don't ask for perfection, because as long as you've got Xi Jinping and Putin in power, then this is their reality. You know, we're going to get it coming at us, and we need to be prepared for it until they're not there. That's just how it is. That's all from me. Thanks, John.
So I do want to share this slide with everyone. It's basically our time to finish. Everyone's been super helpful. I think most people, almost 95% of everyone is stuck with us, even though we've gone over time. I know we could keep talking. And to be honest, we are going to keep talking. This panel is just the first of a number of different events that we're going to do. We have one on other remedies, which an entire event with 5 panelists, a roundtable, which will be just looking at how to deal with that. Just to remind audiences at home, although we will be recording the panelists' remarks and those will be put on social media, most of this is not for attribution. So if you're a journalist or someone like that and you want to reach out to a panelist to ask if you can use the remarks, please do so. I know, Edward Lucas, you had a number of requests for your 20 tools. And so we also have a survey, which if you received your invitation through your email, we will be sending this out, which basically says, how did we do? Did you learn something about the topic? We do seek to educate and security practitioners about these issues, and so it's basically to help us steer that better. In terms of the event that I do want to, I'm just trying to get this in front of me, the date, the 29th, I believe it is, of June, or 30th of June, for the panel that will, 5-person panel that's coming up on how to deal with disinformation. With that, it only leaves for me to do is to thank you all. You've been extremely, super interesting. I think we could have gone on for many more hours. Please, virtually at home, if you would, give our panel an excellent round of applause. A big mahalo from us, from your ohana here at APCSS. And a very big thank you to Professor Anne-Marie Brady, to Edward Lucas, and Dr. Shashi Jayakumar. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you, or this morning, or this afternoon. So thank you, everyone. And we will hope to see you soon at our next events. Goodbye.